Hi, I'm Eunice, and this is the story of how I came home for a holiday dinner and left with the only truth that ever really mattered. They celebrated my sister with speeches and slideshows while I cleared the dishes like a stranger in my own childhood home. But sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one carrying everything no one wants to face. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever had to earn your place in a family that never truly saw you? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a story about presence, legacy, and the kind of kindness that speaks when no one else will. I wasn't planning to come back for Thanksgiving, not after everything. But one casual email, buried between newsletters, made me stop breathing for a second. Hope you can join us for Sophie's celebration. Rain dropped steadily outside the window, tracing uneven lines down the glass. My tea's gone cold. I stared at the screen, rereading the sentence like it might change if I blinked hard enough. Celebration. Not a greeting. Not a question about how I was doing. Just a one-liner invitation with Sophie's name bolded and underlined. Like a headline in a family newsletter I was never subscribed to. The last time I set foot in my parents' house was during Grandpa's funeral. I remember the way the carpet muffled my steps, how my presence barely registered. I sat through the service in the second row, while Sophie delivered a flawless eulogy in soft lilac and patent heels. I left the same night. No hugs, no send-off. Just the hum of the Greyhound station and a crumpled bus ticket back to Portland. Natalie stirred honey into her mug across from me at the kitchen table, watching without pushing. That's what I appreciated most about her. She never filled silences just to escape them. When I finally exhaled, she tilted her head. So, you going? I don't know, I said. Feels like walking into a performance I never got cast in. She reached out, refilled my cup without asking. Sometimes, showing up is how you close the door behind you. I turned toward my bookshelf. Between a stack of old conference folders and receipts I'd meant to file, I found the manila envelope. I hadn't looked at it in nearly a year. Grandpa's scrawl still marked the front in a shaky pen. For Eunice only. I remembered the afternoon we'd prepared it. He'd insisted on typing every sentence slowly, even though his hands shook with every keystroke. This isn't for drama, he told me. It's just time things were fair. I'd driven him to the notary office, wheeled him up the ramp myself. We mailed copies to the lawyer. He smiled the whole ride back home. That was the last time he left the house. I held the envelope now, fingers brushing the crease. I hadn't planned to bring it. I hadn't even meant to open that drawer today. But something inside me shifted as I placed it on top of my packed duffel. My flight wasn't until tomorrow morning. The suitcase was only half full, just enough clothes for a 2-day stay, and my work laptop out of habit. I stared out the window at the gray Portland skyline, my reflection faint in the glass. Behind me, the apartment looked like it always did. Books stacked in corners. A dying succulent I still watered out of stubbornness. A coat rack with only my things. Natalie handed me a slice of apple cake, a fork already on the plate. Closure isn't for them, she said. It's for you? I nodded, folding the envelope between sweaters. That evening, I made soup I didn't finish, stared at a show I'd already watched, and turned off the lights at exactly 9 p.m. I'd promised myself I'd keep it simple. Show up, eat, smile politely, leave. But my hand paused on the zipper of the duffel one more time before I went to bed. I reached inside and tapped the edge of the envelope, still sealed. I sat on the edge of my bed, brushing a hand over the quilt my grandmother had sewn. The stitching was uneven, the fabric worn from years of laundering. I had taken it from Grandpa's house after the funeral. No one else noticed it was gone. It smelled like cedar and faintly of old aftershave. I used to curl beneath it when I visited during winter breaks, sipping tea while Grandpa quizzed me on logic puzzles. I thought about those puzzles now, the ones where you had to eliminate possibilities until only one remained. Family was supposed to be the one constant. Mine had been a riddle I stopped solving years ago. Back in the kitchen, I poured the rest of the cold tea down the drain. The light above the sink buzzed faintly. In the quiet, I could almost hear Grandpa's voice again, patient and deliberate. "They won't see you coming, but you'll know who you are." I hadn't planned to bring the will, but suddenly it felt like the only thing I couldn't leave behind. Sophie greeted me like I was a colleague she hadn't seen in years. Polite, smile too tight. "Wow, Eunice, look at you! Still doing computer stuff?" The front steps creaked under my boots as I approached the house, the familiar flickering porch light buzzing overhead. A wreath of faux autumn leaves hung on the door, a little too bright, too symmetrical. Like everything else in this house, it gave the illusion of warmth without the substance. Sophie opened the door before I could knock, her voice sugar-sweet, her arms outstretched as if we'd been close just yesterday. "Wow, Eunice, look at you," she said again. "Still doing computer stuff?" I nodded. "Yeah, still doing that." She ushered me inside before I could say more. The house smelled like cinnamon candles and turkey grease. Every surface gleamed. Mom must have spent all morning scrubbing. There were voices from the dining room, bursts of laughter, the clink of wine glasses. I set my bag down quietly by the coat rack. Aunt Janelle waved half-heartedly as she passed, her arms full of folded linens. "Hey there, sweetheart. Long time." No hug, no, "How have you been?" Sophie led me into the living room, already crowded with family. The fireplace flickers on low. Everyone was dressed in rich browns and oranges, like a Hallmark movie casting call. I looked down at my soft gray sweater and black slacks. Clean, professional, quiet, just like me. "We saved you a seat," Mom said, motioning toward the far end of the table, right beside the swinging kitchen door. "Thanks," I murmured, taking the spot without protest. I was used to this seat, the one with a view of backs and elbows, where the cold draft from the hallway always found its way. Dinner began with a toast to Sophie's recent promotion. Dad stood first, his wine glass raised high. "To our shining star," he said, "making waves in the marketing world and still finding time to come home." Applause broke out. I clapped too, because that's what you do. Sophie beamed, cheeks flushed with pride. She held up her glass. "And to the family, who always believed in me." A few heads turned toward me, just briefly, then turned back. Mom passed around a box. Inside was a silver watch with a delicate blue face. "A little something from all of us," she said. Sophie gasped. "It's beautiful. You didn't have to." Dad chuckled. "Of course we did." Someone handed me a paper plate instead of the china everyone else had. I smiled anyway. The green bean casserole was cold by the time it reached me. I passed it along without comment. "So, Eunice," Uncle Mike said between bites of stuffing, "you still living out west?" "Yes," I said. "Portland?" "Still working with computers?" He sounded like he wasn't quite sure that counted as a real job. "I'm a systems architect," I clarified. "I work on data security for financial firms." Right. He nodded vaguely. "Well, someone's got to do that stuff." I bit the inside of my cheek and looked down at my plate. Later, as dessert plates were cleared, I offered to help with dishes. "Oh, no, honey. Mom said, waving a hand. You relax. Sophie's the guest of honor. I nodded again. Always the shadow in the room where someone else shone. I wandered back toward the table and picked up my purse from beneath the chair. The envelope was still there, still sealed, still heavy with a truth no one else seemed ready for. I pat my purse beneath the table. The envelope is still there, still sealed, but not for long. He would have loved this dinner, Mom said. I nodded, though I knew Grandpa would have hated the noise and showmanship. I slipped out the back door once dessert was served. No one noticed. They were too busy laughing at Sophie's slideshow, childhood photos set to upbeat jazz, compliments flying like confetti. My seat near the kitchen had started to feel like a stage wing, and I didn't want to spend the rest of the evening watching someone else's spotlight. The night air hit my face like a soft reminder that silence still existed. I stepped onto the deck, my breath visible in the cold. The backyard looked almost exactly the same. Faded lawn chairs stacked against the shed, Grandpa's bird feeder still hanging from the maple tree, though no birds visited this time of year. The porch lights cast long shadows across the leaves, blanketing the ground. I took a slice of pumpkin pie with me, wrapped in a paper napkin. Sitting on the bottom step, I balanced it on my knee, staring out across the yard. The quiet out here was so complete, it made me feel more present than anything that had happened inside the house. He would have hated all that, I whispered to myself, thinking of Grandpa's preference for slow, meaningful conversations over the clamor of rehearsed praise. In my pocket was a small letter I hadn't told anyone about, not even Natalie, folded in quarters, its edges worn from being opened and reread over the past year. Grandpa had tucked it behind the will, a last-minute addition he made on the day we finalized everything. That day came back to me in flashes. The steady click of the keyboard, the way he adjusted his glasses before every sentence, the way he looked at me as if he was seeing both the girl I was and the woman I was becoming. He said, "They'll remember you differently, if not now, then someday." I unwrapped the pie and took a bite. The crust crumbled, buttery and cold. It tasted like every Thanksgiving before things got complicated, before Sophie became the family's star, before I stopped trying to earn space at the table. I remembered the time Grandpa had asked me to help him reformat an old laptop, one that still ran Windows 98. He'd refused to upgrade, said it had character. We spent the whole weekend on it. He asked more questions than necessary, not because he didn't understand, but because he wanted to hear how I explained things. Afterward, he smiled and said, "You teach with patience." That's rarer than you think. That was the first time anyone told me I was good at something that didn't require a spotlight. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the letter. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Sharp, deliberate, the same way he played chess. "To my Eunice," it began, "you gave me your time when it was worth more than anything in the world." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My eyes blurred, not from sadness, but from something quieter. Recognition, maybe. Or relief. He saw me. Even if no one else had. He saw me. From inside the house, the sound of laughter swelled again, followed by the clatter of utensils. Then Sophie's voice floated out. "Let's do dessert and the slideshow." I stood slowly, brushing crumbs from my lap. My fingers grazed the envelope again through the fabric of my coat. My shoes crunched over the dry leaves as I made my way back toward the house, heart steadier than it had felt all night. From inside, Sophie's voice rises. "Let's do dessert and the slideshow." Eunice stands, brushing crumbs off her coat. "Time," she says quietly, "is now." He would have loved this dinner, Mom said. I nodded, though I knew Grandpa would have hated the noise and showmanship. I slipped out the back door once dessert was served. No one noticed. They were too busy laughing at Sophie's slideshow, childhood photos set to upbeat jazz, compliments flying like confetti. My seat near the kitchen had started to feel like a stage wing, and I didn't want to spend the rest of the evening watching someone else's spotlight. The night air hit my face like a soft reminder that silence still existed. I stepped onto the deck, my breath visible in the cold. The backyard looked almost exactly the same. Faded lawn chairs stacked against the shed, Grandpa's bird feeder still hanging from the maple tree, though no birds visited this time of year. The porch lights cast long shadows across the leaves blanketing the ground. I took a slice of pumpkin pie with me, wrapped in a paper napkin. Sitting on the bottom step, I balanced it on my knee, staring out across the yard. The quiet out here was so complete, it made me feel more present than anything that had happened inside the house. He would have hated all that, I whispered to myself, thinking of Grandpa's preference for slow, meaningful conversations over the clamor of rehearsed praise. Inside, they were probably passing around photos of Sophie holding certificates or wearing crowns from school pageants. I could almost hear Mom's voice narrating every milestone. I wondered if they remembered Grandpa's last Thanksgiving. He had barely spoken, but he watched everything, his eyes sharp behind his thick glasses. That night, he squeezed my hand when no one was looking. Have you ever felt like I do now? The feeling of being an extra, invisible person in your own family. If you sympathize with me, please leave a comment number 9 in the comments section below. Now, let's get to the next development of this story. In my coat pocket was the small letter I hadn't told anyone about, not even Natalie. Folded in quarters, its edges worn from being opened and reread over the past year. Grandpa had tucked it behind the will, a last-minute addition he made on the day we finalized everything. That day came back to me in flashes. The steady click of the keyboard, the way he adjusted his glasses before every sentence, the way he looked at me as if he was seeing both the girl I was and the woman I was becoming. He said, "They'll remember you differently, if not now, then someday." I unwrapped the pie and took a bite. The crust crumbled, buttery and cold. It tasted like every Thanksgiving before things got complicated, before Sophie became the family's star, before I stopped trying to earn space at the table. I remembered the time Grandpa had asked me to help him reformate an old laptop, one that still ran Windows 98. He'd refused to upgrade, said it had character. We spent the whole weekend on it. He asked more questions than necessary, not because he didn't understand, but because he wanted to hear how I explain things. Afterward, he smiled and said, "You teach with patience. That's rarer than you think." That was the first time anyone told me I was good at something that didn't require a spotlight. He used to call me his quiet compass. I never asked what he meant, but I think I knew. I didn't point in flashy directions. I just pointed true. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the letter. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Sharp, deliberate, the same way he played chess. "To my Eunice," it began, "you gave me your time when it was worth more than anything in the world." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My eyes blurred, not from sadness, but from something quieter. Recognition, maybe, or relief. He saw me, even if no one else had. He saw me. I ran my fingers across the edge of the paper, lingering on the indentation his pen had left behind. This wasn't a note scrawled in passing. It was deliberate, thought through. He had written it when he was tired, hands shaking, vision poor. But still he'd made it neat for me. From inside the house, the sound of laughter swelled again, followed by the clatter of utensils. Then Sophie's voice floated out. "Let's do dessert and the slideshow." I stood slowly, brushing crumbs from my lap. My fingers grazed the envelope again through the fabric of my coat. My shoes crunched over the dry leaves as I made my way back toward the house, heart steadier than it had felt all night. "I know it's late," I said, standing up from my spot near the kitchen, "but there's something I need to share. Something Grandpa wanted you all to hear." The laughter died down slowly, like the last notes of a song no one realized had ended. Forks clinked against empty dessert plates, and someone coughed awkwardly. At the far end of the table, Sophie looked mildly annoyed, still clutching the remote for the slideshow. I hadn't planned on interrupting. I hadn't planned on speaking at all. But the envelope in my coat pocket burned like a coal I couldn't ignore anymore. Mom blinked at me, uncertain whether I was joking. "You need to share something? Now?" I nodded. "It won't take long." Dad cleared his throat. "We're kind of in the middle of—" "It's about Grandpa," I said. That silenced the room faster than anything else could have. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Maybe because it wasn't just sound, it was weight. The kind you accumulate over years of being the quiet one, the one who didn't raise her hand, the one whose name got left off cards and email threads. I wasn't standing up for drama. I was standing up because something inside me finally said, "No more waiting." I reached into my purse, feeling the smooth edge of the folder, the satisfying weight of truth. I laid it gently on the tablecloth. My fingers trembled, but not from fear, from finality. "This," I said, "is the will Grandpa updated last year. Some of you might not know about it, but he asked me to be the one to share it." Aunt Janelle exchanged a glance with Uncle Mike. Sophie scoffed. "Updated? Why would he update it without telling Mom and Dad?" "Because he didn't want to be pressured," I said simply. "He told me he wanted it to reflect what mattered to him at the end." I opened the folder and took out the letter first. "He also wrote this, personally." Mom shifted in her chair. "Is this legal?" "Notarized," I replied, placing a second sheet next to the first. "Witnessed. Filed with his lawyer." I noticed a few people leaning forward. Some are confused, others are skeptical. One or two, I couldn't tell who, just curious. Sophie stood up. "Okay, this is weird. You've been gone for years, Eunice, and now you show up with— what? Some secret document?" Uncle David raised a hand. "Let her speak." I met his eyes, surprised. He gave a small nod, quiet but steady. I read aloud from the letter, Grandpa's words quivering just slightly in my voice. "To the one who gave me her Saturdays, who never asked for anything, and who reminded me what time well spent looks like. I leave what peace I can offer." It felt like he was in the room again, not as a ghost, but as a presence, a truth no one could swat away. Silence. Then I summarized the rest. The house, Grandpa's savings, and part ownership in the Community Foundation's small trust, left to me, along with the instruction to establish a scholarship in our names, his and mine. "That's insane," Sophie muttered. "You're not even around. Why would he give you the house?" "He said I made it feel like home," I answered. My voice was steady now, not defensive, just sure. Dad's jaw tensed. "So what, we get nothing?" I didn't reply. I didn't need to. This wasn't about them not getting something. It was about Grandpa choosing who gave without asking. "He told me," Uncle David said suddenly, clearing his throat, "last summer. Said he was proud of you, that you showed up when no one else did." All eyes turned to him. Uncle David rarely spoke during these dinners. Maybe he'd had enough too. Mom's voice turned shrill. You always wanted to divide this family. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I stood a little straighter and said the one thing I'd wanted to say for years. I looked straight at her and said calmly, No. I just refused to disappear. Uncle David helped clear the dishes, while everyone else retreated to the living room, avoiding my eyes like I was the one who'd broken something. I stacked the plates quietly, rinsing them under lukewarm water as he brought in more from the table. Neither of us spoke for a while. The sound of running water and silverware tapping against porcelain filled the silence better than small talk ever could. Finally, he dried his hands on a dish towel and leaned against the counter. You did good, he said softly. I looked over. It didn't feel good. He nodded. Truth rarely does, especially when people have built their lives around a version that flatters them. I wanted to say thank you, but the words sat too heavily in my chest. Instead, I handed him a clean glass and focused on the hum of the dishwasher. From the living room, the sound of Sophie's voice rose. High, agitated, but not loud enough to catch the words. Someone turned up the volume on the TV. My parents' classic move. Drowned discomfort in sitcom reruns and half-hearted laughter. Uncle David noticed my glance. They'll calm down. Maybe not tonight, maybe not next week, but eventually. Do you believe that? I believe they'll pretend, he said with a wry smile. That's something. I set the last plate aside and wiped my hands. There's one more thing, I said. About Grandpa. He raised an eyebrow. More? I nodded and pulled out the small envelope I'd tucked into the back pocket of my purse. The second letter. The one Grandpa asked me not to read until after the will had been shared. I haven't opened it yet, I admitted, but I think it might explain why he did what he did. He stepped back, giving me space. Then maybe it's time. I opened it carefully. Grandpa's handwriting was less steady in this one. The strokes wobbled, but the letters were still deliberate. I read silently at first, then aloud, because the kitchen had gone still, and I needed another human heart in the room. If they're angry, let them be. You don't owe anyone an apology for being the only one who showed up. You taught me something in those afternoons, how to be seen without demanding attention. I hope one day they'll learn it too. Uncle David breathed out slowly. He really saw you. I nodded, swallowing past the lump in my throat. I didn't think anyone did. You were wrong, he said gently. And I think you're not as alone as you think. I wasn't sure if he meant himself or something else, but I appreciated it either way. A soft knock on the kitchen doorway made us both turn. Mrs. Henderson stood there, holding her coat in one hand, a container of cranberry relish in the other. Sorry to interrupt, she said. I was just about to head out when I overheard what happened. My heart tightened. I hadn't seen her all evening. She must have slipped in late, the way she always used to, quiet as a leaf turning in the wind. She stepped closer. I know it's not my place, but I wanted to say something. Of course, I said. She set the container down and clasped her hands. Your grandfather, he talked about you every week. I don't think the rest of them ever knew how much you meant to him, but I did. Uncle David pulled out a chair for her. She didn't sit, just looked me straight in the eye. When he got too tired to cook, you brought meals. When he couldn't lift the rake, you cleared his yard. Not for recognition, not for guilt. You just did it. And he loved you for that. My throat burned. I hadn't expected this. Not from her, not here. He used to tell me, she went on, that you reminded him of his mother. Quiet, steady, always watching, always working. She gave me a small, sad smile. You were the reason he still believed in family. She lays a hand on my shoulder before leaving. You were the reason he still believed in family. Natalie met me at the airport with 2 coffees and a question in her eyes she didn't have to ask. I hugged her tighter than usual. It wasn't dramatic, just a firm kind of gratitude, the kind that says, "Thank you for being real." The drive back to Portland was quiet in the best way. Rain dotted the windshield, and she played a playlist I hadn't heard in years, one we made in college, full of old acoustic covers and forgotten indie bands. I watched the gray blur of highway slip past, my mind still tangled in fragments from the past 48 hours. "I'm proud of you," Natalie said softly, eyes on the road. "For what?" "For choosing peace over performance?" I smiled faintly and took a sip of my coffee. It didn't feel brave. It felt overdue. Back home, I unpacked slowly. No rush. No more sense of urgency to prove anything. I folded the coat I wore to Thanksgiving and placed it at the back of the closet. The envelope, now empty, was tucked into the back of my journal. Not to hide, just to rest. The next week passed gently. I answered emails, went to work, cooked for myself. I went to the library on a Tuesday evening and stayed until it closed. Life resumed, but it didn't feel like I was picking up where I left off. It felt like I had started walking forward again after standing still for too long. On Sunday, I met with the lawyer Grandpa had used. He confirmed the scholarship paperwork had already been drafted months ago. All I had to do was approve the name. I didn't hesitate. The Charles Whitmore and Eunice Grant Scholarship for Quiet Leaders. "Nice ring to it," the lawyer said, smiling over his glasses. I nodded. That's what he wanted. We talked logistics, tax filings, foundation partners. I signed what I needed to sign. When we were done, he walked me out and said, "Your grandfather was a rare man. It's clear the apple didn't fall far." That night, I lit a candle in my kitchen window. Something Grandpa used to do every time someone he loved was traveling or needed clarity. I didn't believe in superstition, but I liked the gesture. Light in darkness, a message without words. Sarah called the next day. "They're still talking," she said. "Mostly about how you ambushed Thanksgiving." I laughed. "Let them. They're also mad you didn't say goodbye." "I did," I said, "just not out loud." There was a pause. Then, "You okay?" "I think I'm finally becoming okay." 2 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. Handwritten. No return address. I knew the handwriting before I opened it. "Eunice, you surprised me. I didn't expect you to stand up the way you did. Maybe I underestimated you. I don't agree with what Grandpa did, but I see now that he had his reasons. Mom and Dad are still furious, but I'm tired. Maybe you and I can talk one day. Sophie." I didn't reply. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I didn't throw the letter away either. I left it in the drawer where I keep stamps, postcards, and other small things that wait for their time. That evening, I took a long walk through Laurelhurst Park. The trees were bare now, branches arching like open arms. I passed a father teaching his daughter to ride her bike, a young couple walking their dog, a woman sketching squirrels on a bench. No one knew me here, but I knew myself, and that was enough. Some truths take years to be spoken, and even longer to be heard. Standing in that kitchen, with a letter in my hand and a life finally named, I realized I hadn't come home for forgiveness. I came home to finish a chapter I never got to write. We're so quick to measure worth by volume, by presence, by perfection. But real value lives in consistency, in quiet generosity, in the people who show up without needing a spotlight. Kindness, the kind that asks for nothing, still changes everything. Like the light Grandpa used to leave on in the window, even on nights no one was coming home. It's not about who sees it. It's about what it reminds us that someone cared. And maybe that's enough. If this story left a quiet warmth in your heart, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe, so we can keep sharing moments that remind us what truly matters.